And as far as we can tell, windows and structures actually date back to about the 13th century BC. And as you might expect, they were just simple unglazed openings in a roof, so they were actually skylights designed to admit light. And then pretty shortly after that, they were later covered with animal hide, cloth, wood, to keep the elements out, to keep bugs out, to keep animals out. Shutters came very closely after that. And then over time, windows have devolved or developed to both protect the inhabitants from the
Good.
elements and to transmit
You
light
gotta
into
see
the
who's there.
structure. And those very earlier primitive windows use multiple small pieces of some kind of translucent material, like flattened pieces of animal horn or very thin slices of marble, or even pieces of primitive glass set in a frame of wood or iron or lead. And then that's what we used for hundreds and thousands of years after that. As far as we can tell, the Romans were essentially the first to use glass for windows, a technology that was actually first developed probably sometime in Roman occupied Egypt around 100 AD. Paper was actually used widely as an economical material in China, Korea, Japan, and kind of throughout Asia. In England, windows made up of panes of flattened animal horn, of all things, were used as early as the 14th century AD now, so 3,000 years after the first windows appear. And again, the history of this is just fascinating. In the 19th century American West, people often used greased paper or greased cloth or greased or oiled animal skin as a window material. So something mundane and even then relatively common was basically oiled to make it kind of translucent and a little bit weatherproof and used to let light into houses. What we think of as modern windows only became possible after industrial plate glass, after that process was actually, that manufacturing process was fully perfected. And we are going to talk just a little bit about that. But if you go back and look at pictures of ancient windows, something like this, with this is actually a piece of animal skin that's been oiled to let more light into the structure. And this actually is from the American West. I figured that was more germane to us. Were very, very common up until actually really recent history. So when you start looking at windows, you have to look obviously at window glass. And this is the part of this that just absolutely fascinated me. So the first ever known glass was obviously black and volcanic, and it was used by prehistoric people. It's obsidian for making weapons and jewelry, money, things like that. The earliest glass manufacturing started about 3500 BC, so long before windows came into vogue, in Mesopotamia in Egypt. And then that region actually became kind of the world glass manufacturing center for the next 500 years or so. Manufacturing that glass was a very slow and difficult process because they could only do it in very small furnaces with naturally fired and then heated by bellows coal, wood, things like that. But that eventually changed when well, it's what's today modern day Syria actually introduced the blowpipe, making the process faster, easier, and cheaper. But this very early primitive glass wasn't used for making windows because it was very small batch production. It was mostly used for making vessels and jewelry and housewares, essentially. It's not until much later that we actually start to use glass in windows. So this art of glass production eventually makes its way to Rome and its colonies, like so many things in the modern world did, and it's refined and done at scale finally by about the end of the first century AD. So 3,500 years after it was first developed, that glass finally became a commonly available material in the Roman world. So in what we often think of as the beginnings of civilization. And it was during this period that the Romans were first able to make window glass. But it's not what we think of as window glass. It was very uneven in thickness. It was not see through, although it was kind of translucent and allowed some light to pass through. So you can actually find, you can actually buy off of eBay and places like that pieces of ancient Roman window glass. And this is a picture of that kind of being reassembled to what it would have looked like. So windows back then, although they did exist, vastly, vastly different than what we think of windows today. So as this process continues to develop, churches beginning in about the 4th century in Europe were using stained glass to create what we now think of as a modern stained glass window, and that was actually a dominant art form in that millennium. And it isn't until about the early 17th century that what we think of as the first real window glass is being manufactured and made more popular for houses across the Western world. That manufacturing process was still crude, although the way they did it was kind of ingenious. They would essentially blow or create a lengthy balloon of glass and then cut the ends off of it, slit it down the middle, and flatten it out so that cylinder was flattened out to make window glass. Still, there's limits on this process, meaning we can't make large sheets of glass for windows, which is why when you look at old windows actually coming into colonial periods here in America, why they have multiple panes of glass that are fastened together with bars or what are called muntins, because we couldn't manufacture pieces of glass any bigger than that, at least not economically and at scale. So now we have clearer windows, but although they're beginning to look like a modern day window, still large differences in that manufacturing process. The first US glass factory was actually in the Jamestown colony in the early 1600s, still using that same bubble of glass manufacturing to make windows and to cut it into shapes here in the colonies at that point in time. After that comes what's called crown glass, where you take a sphere of molten glass, you poke it with a rod, and you spin it into a circular sheet and cut it into panes. That has imperfections in it, but it's becoming clearer and more see-through all the time, and it's better than what was called the broad glass that we've been talking about up until this point in time. After that, there's another cylinder method of manufacturing glass in Germany that's developed in Germany in the 1830s, making even larger sheets of glass available. Drawn glass was developed in 1904, which means you take a piece or you place a slot in a tank of molten glass, and then you draw sheets of glass through that slot, run it over water-cooled rollers, and then put it into a cooling chamber, allowing you to manufacture even larger flat pieces of glass. At about the same time all this is going on, there's something called the Colburn machine that's introduced, where a sheet of glass is drawn vertically from the surface of molten glass and then gently bent over a roller until it lays horizontally. So kind of the same idea, a little bit different process, but for both of these, the glass has to be ground and polished afterwards to make it clear and to make it really see-through. So it's produced on machines that essentially end up with long sheets of glass that are then cut and polished and looked something like this at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, so into the very beginnings of the 20th century. And it's not until after 1900 that we actually develop modern glass. And that it's essentially invented by a French chemist named Edouard Benedictus, who discovers laminated glass when the glass beaker he's working with, well, he has a plastic material inside of it, a cellulose nitrate, drops it to the floor and shatters it, but the glass doesn't break into pieces. He's essentially inventing modern safety glass. So that process of inserting a thin plastic film between two sheets of glass allows for the development of large sheets of what we would today call safety glass. It's not until the mid 20th century that our most modern method of producing glass is invented by a guy named Alistair Pilkington, and he invents what's called float glass, which is still how we make glass today, at least in large sheet form. And they do that by pouring molten glass onto a bed of molten tin, so literally liquid metal. That glass then floats, spreads out on top of that tin, and you can take it off the end of that hot molten metal bath and form large sheets of clear glass with it. And all of that means that finally today, all these years later, 5,000, 6,000 years later, we have modern glass that we can make into large pieces of, well, see-through window pane that gives us the windows that we have today that we're going to go through and talk about a little bit more. So all of this leads to the glass that today's homeowners have: laminated safety glass, obscured glass, tempered glass, low E glass, all of which are used in Windows today, which we will go through and talk about a little bit more here. This is a little hard to see in this picture, but this is actually how float glass is made today. And if you look very carefully, you can see rollers that are pulling that glass off of that bed of molten tin and forming it into large, very clear sheets of glass for use, well, for our purposes in window manufacturing. Whew, so now that we know a little bit about glass, let's talk a little bit about the evolution of Windows. And we're going to start in relatively modern times because, like so many other things, Windows didn't change much for hundreds or thousands of years. So let's go back to colonial America and start looking at it from that point of view. So colonial windows were typically small casement windows and were often paired with wood or brick mullions, and that's the centerpiece that divides two windows, separating the rotating sashes of those casement windows. The frames of those windows would have been made from either wood or iron and featured diamond-shaped leaded or rectangular panes because remember, in colonial America, we can only manufacture small translucent pieces of glass. Vertical sliding sashes, what we kind of think of as a more modern window, were developed by the 17th century. The earliest versions of those were single hung, and by the end of that century, so by about 1700 or so, double hung sash windows had actually become a fairly dominant style. Um, so now you've got kind of a mix of casement windows and double hung windows to the point where Georgian homes a little bit later on in our history featured double hung windows with 12 over 12 or 9 over 9 sashes and thick muntins in between the panes. As glass became more available in larger pieces, the size of windows increased. So then as the federal style comes into vogue, you get narrower muntins dividing those pieces of glass combined with larger panes of 6 over 6 windows that are both bigger and more delicate looking. So 19th century style houses, so now we're at about 1800 and onward from Greek Revival through Queen Anne, benefited from the glass improvements that we talked about, and those panes shift from a 6 over 6 to a single pane in each sash, allowing for wide unobstructed fields of view and much, much bigger windows. About this same time, we're developing scroll saw technology, so we're able to create new shapes and decorative features, including OG-shaped windows on Gothic houses, rounded arches on Italianate houses. There are lots of new ornamental possibilities being developed in the 1800s. And then as we get into the 20th century, arts and crafts houses, and if you guys have listened to me talk before or been in classes, you know arts and crafts houses are my favorite style of house ever, but those make popular the double hung window, sometimes with a multi-paned upper sash, as well as casement windows. So now we've gone a little bit full circle and we're back to both casement windows and double hung windows, but with different trim styles and different shapes of muntin in them. And as these houses become popular, the elaborate trim of previous houses falls out of favor. It's replaced by flat woodwork that was more in keeping with that developing arts and crafts aesthetic. And that's still essentially the style of window that we use today. So like everything else in the housing industry, improvements in manufacturing technology in both glass and in the window itself eventually lead us to the types of windows that we use in houses to this day. This is actually, I believe it's Federalist House. My wife would correct me if she was listening to this presentation, but this one contains both casement windows with an eyebrow up here and these little dormers sticking out of the top, as well as 9x9 double hungs on the bottom that we talked about. These are craftsman windows. This is a 3/1 style window, and this was very common um, for that craftsman aesthetic where you'd have a large unobscured lower pane and then an upper pane that was divided into various sections just for an aesthetic appeal more so than anything else. But you can see how we've gone from multiple smaller pieces of glass in our windows to single bigger pieces of glass. And now we're putting in those dividers strictly for aesthetics, just for decoration. So as we go further through this presentation, essentially there's about 7 different types of windows, and you can split hairs on this that you're likely to see in most modern construction. Single or double hung, which obviously slide along a vertical track, casement windows, which swing from a hinge, just like a door, picture windows, which are large fixed windows, generally speaking, bay windows, which are windows that are grouped together that extend from a house, sliding windows, which is where one section slides over another, just like a patio door, and that's essentially a single hung or a double hung window turned on its side, awning windows, which hinge at the top rather than the side. So that's essentially a casement window turned on its side. There's also what's called a hopper window, where it hinges from the bottom. And then lots of different kinds of decorative windows, which are generally obviously stationary, can be made of glass blocks, stained glass, all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, most of the windows we see in a modern house will fall into one of those categories. Those windows will be made of a number of different materials. So let's go through and talk about some of those windows. By far the most common, because it was the most readily available for hundreds of years, are windows made of wood. So during basically all this time that we've been talking about, wood has dominated as the most affordable and easy to obtain material for window frames. It has a look and a feel that nothing else can really match, and in fact, virtually all other materials seek to kind of mimic the look of a wood window. Wood is a good insulator. It's far better than almost any other kind of window. For example, it provides 1,800 times more insulation than an aluminum frame window does. It's also an excellent barrier to outdoor sounds. Wood windows are easy to install as long as the installer has basic tools and basic carpentry skills. Wood windows will last a lifetime with proper maintenance, but that's the catch. You got to do maintenance on them. And wood is obviously an environmentally friendly green material. There are some cons, however, to wood windows. They require maintenance. And if you do not properly care for them, they will twist, they will swell, they will eventually rot, especially styles which may trap moisture. And I will tell you guys, casement windows, which we see often on higher end houses, tend to trap more moisture than, say, a double hung window does because of the design of the window. So the biggest problem with wood is that it requires maintenance, and if you don't maintain it, eventually it's going to rot. It's also vulnerable to insects, especially termites, although it's not limited to termites. Proper maintenance helps ward off those insects. And wood windows these days are not cheap. They have a higher initial cost than a vinyl or steel framed window, but will last actually longer than most other frames, other types of materials, and wood never rusts or corrodes. So wood actually has a lot of pros to it. The biggest downside is you got to maintain it or it will rot. And then when we see problems during an inspection with wood windows, they generally look something like this, where they have not been maintained and that wood frame, that wood sill, that wood sash has started to rot. Um, we see, to be honest with you, quite a few problems with wood casement windows during inspections. And they will look like this because they are relatively complicated. They're essentially a door that has to be weather stripped. They have flat surfaces in them. They have lots of seams in them. And if you do not properly maintain wood casement windows, you will get some rot that tends to look like this. So I am not, as an inspector, a big fan of wood casement windows. There are a lot of those out there in higher end houses, especially higher end houses built in the 1980s into the early 1990s. So, not a big fan of wooden casement windows. Other window materials, aluminum and metal, were popular for quite a while in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s as a window material, specifically aluminum. It was one of the cheaper options for new windows. Its only other competitor was vinyl. Aluminum it's durable and can withstand the elements. It's not prone to moisture absorption or other rot issues. It's very easy to maintain, especially compared to wood. You never have to paint an anodized or baked on finish aluminum window. Because it's a strong metal, you can have a lightweight, slim profile that you can customize. Aluminum windows are very long lasting with warp resistant construction and very solid mechanical joints, and they came in lots of different colors and styles. Having said that, there were a lot of cons to aluminum windows, and they have very much fallen out of favor. They have a high what's called U value, which means they easily conduct heat and cold, and in some ways they are considered the least green of all window types, at least in terms of efficiency. They were very prone to interior condensation and are also cold to the touch in the wintertime. Very first house I ever owned had aluminum windows, and I absolutely hated them because they were freezing cold in the wintertime. Aluminum is durable, but it will eventually corrode somewhat when you expose it to moisture, and especially if there's any salt, like you're near the ocean. Um, and in the 70s and 80s, it was considered a cheap building material. Keep in mind, the manufacturing of aluminum windows has improved drastically over the last couple of decades, and you absolutely still can buy them out there, but we don't see them much in the residential world anymore because of the temperature conduction problems with them, and they kind of got a bad rap. So when we see aluminum today in the window world, it's often used as a core material with a different, more attractive exterior. So when we see problems with aluminum windows in the inspection business, it's typically because they haven't been maintained, they're hard to work, or it's something like this where we have a high humidity level inside the house. That aluminum window causes a condensation problem, and it actually allows mold to grow inside the house because it's a constant source of moisture. So this is what we see when we typically see problems with aluminum windows. Moving into the most modern materials we see, vinyl windows are, well, basically the vast majority of what's being installed in houses today. A vinyl window is the most cost-effective type of window available today. They can be very energy efficient because that vinyl resists the conduction of heat and cold. They can be Energy Star rated. They can come with low E gas. They can be a very high quality window. They're easily installed, especially when we're replacing existing windows, so they make a really good replacement window. Um, they are close to maintenance free. It's basically just regular cleaning, maybe occasionally some lubrication or replacing a counterbalance that goes bad. Most double hung windows today offer the ability to unlatch and swing into our houses, making cleaning and maintenance on them really easy. They come in lots of colors and styles, and quality ones actually offer a pretty good transferable warranty. So, what are the cons of vinyl windows? They're the most popular type of window today, but that increased demand means lots of different manufacturers and lots of different levels of quality. So homeowners need to be really vigilant when it comes to vinyl windows to make sure they're getting a good quality one, because the cheap ones, well, are just cheap plastic window. So that wide variety of prices and quality means that for the same size, you could pay 200 bucks for a window, you can pay 800 bucks for that same size window or even more, and with that come differences in quality. So lots of different price points, but the cheap ones tend to be really cheap. And also be aware that, like everything else out there, most companies sell different lines of windows with the same manufacturer's name on them that will vary greatly in quality. Another downside, vinyl looks like vinyl. You can't really replicate a wood window with it. Vinyl is cheap to manufacture, keeping window prices low, but it is plastic. It's not a natural quote unquote product, and it does have an environmental impact to it. We see recycled vinyl used in some windows today, but that really cuts down on the quality and durability of those windows, just like when you used recycled vinyl in siding. It's just not as high quality a product as using a virgin vinyl material. So those windows tend to warp and sag more, especially in the heat. And vinyl is naturally kind of soft. It's not naturally a structural material. So for a higher quality vinyl window, it has to be a really complicated extruded shape, or it has to have some kind of aluminum or metal core to it, making it more complicated to manufacture. So the problems we tend to see with vinyl windows tend to be more in the cheap vinyl window range, where it's a lower quality window using a lower quality material and cutting corners to bring down that window cost. And when you do that, if you have, say, a casement window, you can get warping or twisting of that frame, especially in the summer heat, because that vinyl is not structural and it actually softens up a little bit when it gets hot. In a cheap vinyl window over time, even in something as simple as double hung window, it can soften and sag and warp like this vinyl window has here. So vinyl windows have a lot of real benefits to them, but you got to make sure you're buying a quality one or you will eventually get problems with them, including a lot of, unfortunately, the builder grade ones that get put in so much new construction today. And then our final kind of modern window material is actually what we're going to call a clad window. And this is typically now a wooden frame with some kind of vinyl or fiberglass cladding on the outside of it, or maybe even an aluminum cladding on the outside of it. All of those are actually pretty common materials. So what that gives us is a nice looking wood window on the inside. It's well insulated because that wood frame is a really good natural insulating material. They're really good at cutting down on noise transmission. So if you're in a busy location, near a street, God forbid you're by an airport, maybe near train tracks, a clad window might be the window for you. They are considered economically friendly since wood is a renewable resource, and especially if you've got an aluminum clad version of these windows, that aluminum is recyclable as well. They are low maintenance windows and they will last a long, long time with proper care. Clad windows, clad wooden windows are actually considered a very desirable upgrade with up to about an 85% return on investment. You can get them in lots of different customizable colors and finishes and sizes. And in addition to that aluminum cladding, which is so common, you can get a fiberglass clad window, a vinyl clad window, although you will go up in price for those. So aluminum clad wood windows, when we talk about clad windows, are still the most common ones that we see out there. Like anything else, though, there are some cons with those aluminum clad windows. They are expensive, with an average cost of roughly starting at $1,000 per window up to $1,800, $1,900, $2,000 per window, depending on the size and shape and quality of that window. That aluminum cladding that we so often see is conductive and it will transfer heat and cold and lower the efficiency a little bit, especially compared to a good quality vinyl window. Um, Wood windows are low maintenance, but they are not maintenance free. Sorry, clad wood windows are low maintenance, but not maintenance free. And they do require regular inspection, cleaning, and caulking. And in fact, that is a must with clad wood windows because that cladding can come loose over time. Those seams can separate over time. And when they do that, you'll get moisture behind the cladding right up next to the wood, where that moisture gets trapped and can cause rot problems. And in fact, in the inspection business, when we see problems with clad wooden windows, that's typically where we see issues with them. It's when that cladding begins to separate from the underlying wood substrate that you can get into real trouble. So doing that maintenance is an absolute must because you have to keep moisture from getting back behind that cladding, or you'll start to see problems like this. And if you let this go on too long, you start to see problems like this, where moisture sits behind that cladding and just rots away that wooden substrate. And here's another picture of it here. So all of these are really common problems for us to see with clad windows during an inspection. All right, let's switch gears here and talk a little bit as we start to wrap this presentation up. Let's talk about window seals, because when we asked you guys for your questions on windows, I think easily half, maybe 3/4 of the questions we got were about window seals. So let's talk about failed thermal seals in windows. So first of all, real quick, what is a failed thermal seal? Why does that thermal seal actually exist? So what we're talking about here are now either double pane or maybe even triple pane windows where we now have two panes of glass separated by usually a piece of some kind of rubber and then with air or some kind of inert gas in between it. That's called a thermal pane window. And the idea behind those is to make your window more efficient. So with that air or that inert gas in between that window, it cuts down on the window's ability to conduct heat and cold and makes for a more efficient window. So in a double pane window, we have a thermal pane unit, And within that thermal pane unit, we have some kind of seal that keeps air from moving between those two panes of glass. So that is the window seal that we are actually talking about. So when it fails, that's when we have a problem. Is it really a big problem? Well, consider this. A window's job is to let light in, and when we open it, to let air in or out of a house. So if that seal fails, does this really affect the window's function? And the honest answer is no, not really. That failed seal does reduce the energy efficiency of the window, but not by a ton. And it does kind of reduce the functionality of the window because those failed seals will tend to cloud up when moisture gets in between those panes of glass and condenses, forming a fog or droplets of moisture on the inside of those thermal panes. So technically, this means that a failed window seal, actually from an inspection point of view, should probably be considered more of a minor and not a major defect. However, keep in mind that most people hate the look of failed seals because now it's much more difficult to see outside of that window, and aesthetically, it's not pleasing at all. Keep in mind that fixing several of them gets pretty expensive pretty quickly. So while one failed seal is not typically a major defect, a whole bunch of them, primarily because of the cost to fix them that's involved here, can become a major defect in an inspection. Having said all of that, I personally don't think that failed window seals should ever kill a deal, but I have seen it happen out there. So in my mind, failed window seals really aren't that major of a defect, but the cost of replacing a whole bunch of them can bump it up into a territory where a lot of people will consider it a major defect. So um, I apologize for giving you a little bit of a gray, ambiguous answer there. I think the realistic way to think about this is one or two failed window seals, minor defect, a whole bunch of failed window seals, primarily because of the cost, will be considered more of a major defect in an inspection report. Let's also talk real quick here before we answer some questions and wrap up this presentation. Failed window seals can be very difficult to diagnose depending on the time of year, the time of day, weather conditions outside. There's a whole lot of environmental factors that can affect whether we as inspectors can see a failed window seal. So if we see more than one in a house, we should, if we're good inspectors, be writing that up as a general condition defect. So what we should be saying, instead of fix this window and fix this specific window, are something along the lines of numerous windows throughout a structure exhibit failed seals between the thermal panes, further evaluate all the windows in the house, and repair them as required to reduce continued deterioration. Yes, I know that puts the ball in your court as agents and makes your life a little bit more difficult, but if we don't say evaluate all the windows, and if you as agents in your inspection response don't say evaluate all the windows, a thermal seal that is not obvious or not noticeable when we're doing the inspection is going to show up when it gets colder outside or when we get a rainy day like what we've got today and our humidity levels shoot up. And because it wasn't noticeable before, and if you as an agent didn't ask to have all the windows evaluated, we're going to be getting complaint calls later on because that's only going to become discernible later when atmospheric conditions change. I hope that makes sense to you guys, but the takeaway here is if we see more than one failed window seal, where there's one or two, there's probably more. So we're going to write that up as a general condition and recommend that all windows be evaluated, not just the ones where we can see the failed thermal seals, because that protects us, that protects you guys, and that actually protects your buyers later on in the transaction. You guys have all seen failed thermal seals before. They can look like this. They can look like this. They can sometimes be very difficult to diagnose. And that's why we're going to write up basically all the windows in the house and make them a general condition. if we identify more than one of them in any given property. All right, real quick, let's talk about some questions we received, and then we will be done. We had a question, any brands you recommend or don't recommend? There are a ton of window brands out there, some of the more reputable national brands, Pella, Marvin, Peachtree, some lines of Andersen windows. Andersen makes really cheap windows. They make really good replacement windows. All of those pretty decent national brands. Having said that, there's also a lot of really good, relatively local brands of replacement windows out there as well. Are windows heated or rated for heat rejection or gain? Yes, they are. That's called the U value, and you can actually customize windows depending on what climate that you're in. If you're in a cold climate, you might want a window that lets in more heat in the wintertime from the low-lying or low-hanging sun in the sky. If you're in a hot climate, you may want a window that's tuned to reject all heat from the outside of the house. So windows are rated for heat rejection or gain. That's primarily in what's called that U value. Do you write every window with a broken seal on an inspection report? We just went through that, but no, we do not. We absolutely should not be calling out every individual window with a broken seal on an inspection report. When we do that, if we miss one because it's not visible during an inspection, that responsibility, well, they're going to try and complain to us. We're going to tell them that our visual inspection agreement specifically precludes that, and then the responsibility to fix that one that wasn't noticeable during the inspection is going to be on the folks that built that house or bought that house. So no, we do not call out every individual failed seal during an inspection. That is actually the wrong way to report that condition, and I know inspectors do it out there all the time, but not doing that is actually the sign of a good inspector. How much difference do thermal windows really make in heat gain or loss over single pane glass? The number is roughly between 20 and 55% more efficient for double pane glass versus single pane glass. Better explanation of long-term issues that arise from busted thermoseals. Really, we kind of talked about this. Over time, a failed thermal seal, because it's letting a little bit of moisture accumulate in between that glass, can result in fogging. It can eventually result in corrosion or rot of that window, but it takes a long time for those conditions to occur. Is a busted thermal seal a failed window? We just talked about this. One or two of them is a relatively minor item in an inspection report. So in my mind, it's not necessarily a failed window. It's just a failed thermal seal, and it can be repaired. What's some solutions for fixing rot under cladding on windows? Excellent question. If it's minor and just starting, it can be relatively easily repaired by digging out the rot, filling it with some kind of epoxy, and re-adhering that cladding. If it's gone too far, you're going to have to replace the sash or the casement part of that window. That's the only way to fix it. Windows you can't get parts for anymore. You have to modify or replace the windows if you truly can't get parts, but there are a lot of parts available for windows out there. Pros and cons to replacing older windows, another really good question. If the windows are in good shape, there are not a lot of pros to replacing those windows, except maybe if you're dealing with aluminum frames or you want some noise reduction. Keep in mind that in terms of energy efficiency, even replacing old single pane wood windows, it's going to take you more than 50 years to pay back those windows just based on energy efficiency, and they'll probably be ready to be replaced in about 20 years. So you're never going to get that money back in terms of energy efficiency. So if you've got older, good functioning windows, the key here is going to be maintenance, and if they're single pane, maybe installing storm windows. So that's what I would tell first-time buyers who are concerned about the age of windows. Again, it falls into that category of it's not defective just because it's older. Everything can be repaired, windows more so than most, and you will take 50 years to get those windows to pay back on energy efficiency. What happens when you've got good window sashes, essentially, but there's dry rot in the wood casing? The interesting thing about old wood windows is that it's actually relatively easy to repair components in those windows and not replacing the entire window. So usually old wood windows especially, can actually be easily repaired. Thermal seals, we talked about them. The reason they exist is efficiency and what to look for in a good quality window. Hopefully I've given you guys some idea as we've gone through this presentation. I would look for a good quality thermopane filled with argon or another inert glass with some kind of low E coating on those windows, a good substantial frame, whether that be a clad wood window or whether that be a good quality vinyl window, and then you can judge it by the warranty that the manufacturer is willing to put on that window. Is it rated for 20 years, 30 years? It is a lifetime warranty. What's the warranty rating on that window itself? All right, that's the end of the questions I've got. So I've managed to go, well, 12 minutes over our ideal time frame here. Windows, as I hope you guys can see now, absolutely fascinating subject. I hope this was 42 minutes well spent for you guys.